All right, so today we're going to start on exercise 207. We're going to flip back into V-Ray for a day, and then we'll go back into Rhino. So we keep going back and forth. And really, I think this is kind of the thing that everybody looks forward to, because today we'll actually make things look like they're supposed to look. And we're going to cover texture mapping of objects. And what texture mapping is essentially how does the material apply to an object? How big is it? What does it look like? What direction does the material go? Those kinds of questions. And so in the beginning, I'm going to go through a variety of examples, and then we'll get into kind of applying and using block references and stuff towards the end of the lecture today. But in order to get started, I'm going to go ahead and spend a little bit of time organizing a pretend scene with some objects in it. And rather than have it pre-prepared, I want you guys to create it along with me. But I'm going to actually go through all the steps so you see me get this scene ready for some trial objects. I already have one, we'll call it a slightly complicated object that I'm going to use later on to show you kind of advanced texture mapping techniques. We'll get to that a little bit later. But for right now, I want to set up my scene. And I'm going to start in the layers palette. So rather than directly starting to draw things, I'm going to organize my layers palette. And the default of the file that came up, and it may or may not match yours, the default is supposed to be a default layer with 5 extra layers on it. I'm going to go ahead and take layer 5, the bottommost layer, and I'm going to rename it by double-clicking on it. And I'm going to call this layer Environment. And it's good to get in the habit of creating an environment layer. And within the environment layer, we can create a sublayer for, lack of a better term, we'll call it sun, even though we're not actually creating a sun today. And I'll also create, under the environment layer, a sublayer called Infinite Plane. Typically, I call it IP instead of Infinite Plane, but so that it's clear for you guys, I'm calling it Infinite Plane for today. Those two layers will control the bulk of what's happening in my overall scene. And so on the sun layer, I'm going to create a basic directional light. And on the infinite plane layer, I'm going to create an infinite plane. So we'll start with the infinite plane layer. I'll double click on it, which moves my current layer or active layer check mark to it. And then I'll go ahead and come to my V-Ray toolbars. And right here is the Add Infinite Plane button. If for some reason you're missing the toolbars, you can also type Viz, V-I-S, Infinite Plane, and it will give you the infinite plane as well. The infinite plane by default shows up at 0, 0, 0 as its center. And remember that even though it is just a large rectangle, it actually extends off to the horizon in all directions. It's just this plane is representative of the infinite plane. The advantage of putting the infinite plane on an infinite plane layer is after you've created it, and we move to another layer, so I'll go ahead and double click on the sun layer so that that's the active layer, I can come over and lock the infinite plane. And when I do that and I go to select my objects, I can't select the infinite plane anymore. Some of you had trouble with that last class.
I don't have that box on my
This box with the layers in it?
Yeah.
If you go to your standard ribbon, there's a pie-shaped piece about halfway down for layers. Click on that pie-shaped piece and you should get it back. Yeah. If your V-Ray toolbars are missing, you can go to Tools, Toolbar Layout, and then go to File, and then Open. And this is where you have to have downloaded the V-Ray toolbars. So it's probably in your Downloads folder under Computer Setup Files, and it'll be this V-Ray for Rhino v4_TB for toolbar. Give me 1 second to run back there. So I have the infinite plane established. The next thing is I need a basic directional light. So once again, I'm going to use the little box as a cheater to create the directional light. I'll click on the cube here. We'll draw a little box. And then the directional light is the missing icon tool at the end of the V-Ray lights, right here. You can also type directional light. It'll get you there. And I'm going to draw it from the bottom corner to the upper corner. And then I'll go ahead and get rid of the box by pressing the delete key. And that gives me a basic light shining down on my scene, which is what I'm after. So once I have that established, the environment layer constitutes my infinite plane and my sun. In this case, it's the directional light. Long term, we're going to get into creating actual V-Ray suns and pick a time of day and all that sort of thing. But for right now, it's too much. So we're sticking with a basic directional light. So now that I have my directional light and my infinite plane, both of which I can lock, I'm going to move back up. My active layer is now the default layer. I can lock both these, and I won't accidentally select them. They just exist in space for right now. So then I'm going to create a series of objects that we're going to practice our texture mapping on. So the first one that I'll create is kind of a wall-like object, and it'll go toward the back of my scene here. And this is at 12 feet, 1 foot, and we'll go 8 feet tall. If I don't like the placement, we can move it a little closer there. There it is. And then let's go ahead and create a box. And we'll say that this is at 4 feet, 4 feet. And we'll have a height of 4 feet. There we go. There's my little box. And it might need to move forward just a little bit there. And then I want a sphere. So we'll go into my primitives here, and we'll pick the sphere. And center can be right here. And I want my radius to be 2 feet. I'm searching for all about 4 feet by 4 feet. Let me move this, V for vertical, and we'll move it up. You know what? That's really small. Let me try that again. It's in diameter, 4 feet. There we go. Let's move it up. So move, vertical. We'll bring it up so it's above the plane there a little bit. Then we need a cylinder. So 4 feet. And again, my height should be about 4 feet. All of these objects are about the same size. And that way, the texture mapping is consistent across all of them. And then let's see, the last one was a cone. So I'll go here, and I'm going to pick cone. And my radius would be 2 feet. And my height will make it match up. So in terms of composition of these pieces, I don't really care so much where they fall. We're going to look at each object individually as we start to go through texture mapping. So it doesn't matter which one is which. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure all of these end up on their own layer. Currently, it's the default layer. I can rename default to be objects. So all of my objects are on that layer. And for clarity purposes, let's go ahead and get rid of layer 1 through 4. So I'll select layer 1, press the delete key, layer 2, delete button, layer 3, delete button, layer 4, delete button. So now I just have objects and I have environment. So I'm trying to be clean with my layer structure if I can. OK. So at this point, I need to load in a material that will be very obvious in terms of how the texture mapping applies. So I don't want something like basic concrete where I don't see any texture map. I want something with sufficient texture on it. So I'm going to go to my materials, my V-Ray materials editor. And I'll go ahead and right-click on Scene Materials and then Load Material. And I'll go to my flash drive. And under V-Ray, we'll go into V-Ray Materials. And I'm going to go into siding, and I'm going to pick wood, and I want the, I think it's the planks rough wood staggered. You could pick something else, but for me this I think shows very nicely. It's a bunch of even ribbons, and so it'll be very obvious how the texture is applied. So let's go ahead and take this planks rough wood and apply it to my layer. And I'm going to apply it to the objects layer. And unfortunately, it went behind the little dialog box, went behind. See, it disappeared. I'll just minimize, put it on the objects layer. It's not supposed to happen that way. So you should be able to right-click and say Apply Material to Layer. And this pop-up should exist in front of everything else. But sometimes it goes behind, in which case minimize Rhino and you'll see it there. I wish that kind of stuff didn't happen, but it's V-Ray. So we'll go ahead and say OK. And now I would like to be able to kind of get a preview of what my objects look like. And you guys have done this before. I'm going to switch from my standard shaded view into my rendered view. And when I do that, I'll get a preview of what the textures look like on my objects, which is certainly the idea. One of the things to be aware of is this is most definitely just a preview. It's not what it actually is going to look like when it renders. It's just an approximation of it. And you'll see when we get into some of the more complicated things that it doesn't always work correctly. The other thing is, given that my light is cast down in this direction, when I look at the objects from this side, they'll look OK. When I look at the objects from this side, they'll appear black. So because I have the light in the scene, that's the case. And we're going to look at them from this side for right now. So I'm going to go ahead. You don't have to do this, but for clarity purposes, I'm going to select all of the objects except for the cube. And I'm going to type hide, which is just going to make them go away, and let me concentrate on just the cube. And I'm doing this for clarity as I'm going through it, but it's not something that you have to do. You can obviously do it without. So let me zoom and then S for selected so that I'm orbiting around just this object right there. And we're going to take a look at this box. So right now, we know that this is a 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot cube. And if we look at it, it's not bad in terms of texture mapping. It's actually kind of close. And if we look at the sides, we can see that my texture wraps around the side and continues as it wraps around that corner. At the top here, the texture is larger, and it doesn't really connect to anything on any of the sides. It just goes across. So I want to adjust that setting. And I do that by clicking on the object. And it's important to recognize that texture mapping is on an object-by-object basis. So when you select something and apply a texture map to it, it is only applying to that, not to every object that has the material applied to it. It's object only. So I select the object. It's now selected. And I come over here into my properties. And when I click on properties, we see that I have my basic object property showing right now. So this is a closed extrusion. It's on the objects layer. The display color is by layer, blah, 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 blah. Up at the top here, we have a toggle. We have object, then we have material. This tells me that the material is assigned by layer. OK, that's fine. That's how I assigned it. If we move to the last option, it looks kind of like an orange and white checkerboard in kind of a half arc looking thing. If I click on it, that is called texture mapping. And this is how does the material apply to the object itself. And so in this case, and one of the things that I'm going to emphasize a lot in this class, is when in doubt, try to use one of the presets. Because chances are the texture mapping preset that's closest to your object will work. And it involves a lot less steps on your part. So in this case, we have a box. And lo and behold, there's an Apply Box Mapping button. Perfect. So if I click on Apply Box Mapping, nothing happens. Right? No surprise. Look at our command line. It says first corner of base, or by default, do you want to just select the bounding box? Well, it's a box, so a bounding box is perfect. It just selects the overall size of my object. So we'll go ahead and click on bounding box. Then it asks for the coordinate system. Do I want it tied to the C-plane or the world coordinate system? The world is what we want by default. I'll hit enter. And do I want the object capped? Does it have a top on it? In this case, yes, it does. So I want to make sure I select yes. And you see that it instantly changes my object. Number one, the texture got a little smaller. But number two, the size and the spacing of the intervals on top matches up with the size and the spacing of intervals on the side. So I now have something where all of these are matching up. Furthermore, the texture on this side goes up and transitions very nicely across the top. Obviously, it's a box, so on one side it's not going to work. And we're going to have the butt end, which happens to be right there. So by just picking the box mapping, I've instantly made this object look a lot better. When I do that, and the object is selected, and the box mapping is complete, you see that we have some options here that show up that weren't there to begin with. Number one, we have a type of box. That's good. Projection closest point. That's also good. We have some other information about the x, y, and z position. And then down here, we get to our x, y, z size and scale. So because it's a box, notice it says 48, 48, 48. That is 4 feet. 4 times 12 is 48. So it's telling us that this is a 48-inch by 48-inch by 48-inch object, which is fine. In the center down here, I have something called UVW Repeat. This is the easiest way of changing the overall scale of the texture. So right now it's applied 1:1 as a 48-inch object. If I change the UVW Repeat, I can increase the number of times the photograph of this texture is applied. So remember, this texture is essentially, right, we have an object, or excuse me, we have a photograph that looks like this. And it's been seamed so we can attach it together. There's the next one. And here's the next one, etc. So right now, we're using just one picture on each side of the square. If we want to use two of the pictures, which would actually end up with 4, because we're going in multiple directions, we can end up with this condition by changing the UVW mapping to be 2. So we want to use 2 versions of the image. And I do, if you click on the little lock button at the bottom, you don't have to change all 3. You can change just one of them and they'll stay even. So if I go to 2.0, the overall texture gets smaller because I'm using 4 of the images. If I instead went to 0.5, I'd be using half an image and the texture gets bigger. So you can see how you can go through and dramatically change, right? I could go to 0.25, for example, and that's going to make it bigger. I could go to 10 or 8. Let's do 8. And it gets really small. And in this case, because of the repetition of the pattern, you can kind of see, you know, there's 1 square, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them. Do you kind of see that now? So that's how I'm controlling how many times this is applied. By default, 1 should be fairly close to what I'm after. And in this case, it is. So I'm going to go ahead and show the rest of my objects. I'll type show to do that. And now I'm going to work on the wall. So I'll hide the other objects that aren't the wall. So let's go ahead and hide those. Oops. And now I'll work with just the wall. So in this context, once again, I have the wall selected, and I move from my properties from the object to the texture mapping property. This wall is kind of like a box. It's not a cube per se. It's not exactly a box, but it's kind of like a box. So let's go ahead and apply the box mapping to it. And so I'll click on it, first corner of base or bounding box. Again, I'll just pick the bounding box. My coordinate system should be world, and yes, it is capped. OK, so it applied my texture to the, let's look at it from this side. But so it looks kind of funny on top and bottom. It's no longer even, wouldn't you say? So I want to make an adjustment so that it's not squished and it's not repeating a bunch of times on top different than it is on the side. And if I come down here and I look at my texture mapping, if I look under XYZ size, we get 144, which would be 12 feet in one direction. We get 12 inches, which would be 1 foot. And we get 96, which would be 8 feet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click this middle button, which is x equals y equals z. And when I click that, these numbers are going to change to all be set at the middle number. So in this case, they're all 84. And if I look at it, okay, my texture now wraps around the corner here, and my texture wraps around the top there. So they're all roughly the same as the box by clicking x equals y equals z. I can now adjust my UVW repeat. So if I wanted it to be a little bit smaller, I could do maybe 1.5. And it gets a little bit smaller. And I get that. So again, I'm using, let me select it again. I'm using the box texture map, but I'm making a few adjustments here, one of which is the x equals y equals z, which eliminates the squishing on the sides and on the top. OK, so I now have that one. So let's go ahead and show the rest of my objects. I've done these two. Let me move on, and we'll do the sphere. So I'll take the rest of these objects, and we'll hide them. We'll zoom selected on the sphere. And so this is inherently challenging. Now, in reality, if we were trying to apply this wood band texture to a sphere, it would be inherently impossible, right? We'd have to like wet the boards and bend them, and it doesn't really work. But in this case, we'll still use it as our illustration purposes. By default, it's not too bad. But let's go ahead and look at it anyway. If we select the object, instead of using the box mapping, which we could, right? The problem with the box mapping, I'll go ahead and do the box mapping for right now, just so you can see. Bounding box, world, it's capped. You see that the projection projects nicely there and on the sides, but we get these really weird intersections here where the corner projections don't quite work. You see that? So we don't like that. So I'll go back to selecting the objects. I'll remove my mapping, and then we'll go ahead and apply the spherical mapping. So we'll do that. It says, again, I use bounding box here, world coordinate system, and there it is. It looks essentially the same as the mapping that we started with. No change, except that now I have all the ability to change, like the repeat. So UVW repeat at maybe 1.5. Oops, I didn't mean 0.5, I meant 1.5. And we get more on the object. So not much change. The default mapping was close to what I wanted. The difference here is now I can actually make adjustments to it. Okay? And just like the box, it matches up perfectly with the sphere. So let's go ahead and show the rest of my objects. And you see that I'm moving my way through the objects here. Let's hide them, and let's go to the cylinder. So on the cylinder, if we look, we have a sphere, we have a box, but we also have a cylindrical mapping widget. Let's go ahead and pick that one. It's going to ask me for the base of the cylinder, or I can just pick a bounding box. That's fine. My coordinate system can be world, and I want it to be capped. And now I'm even in the spacing down the side and on the top. Obviously, the matchup along the side is less critical. It's more about having the even spacing. If I select it and I change my UVW repeat to 0.5, for example, I get fewer bands like that. Okay, so again, I'm trying my best to use one of the default texture maps. So let's go ahead and hide this one and move on to the cone. So the cone starts to get very challenging. So in this case, I have a texture mapping that's making the boards get smaller and narrower as they get to the top. Maybe I want instead for them to go around. If I go to my texture mapping, there isn't a cone preset at all. So here's our first challenge. So I could do the cylindrical mapping. That's probably the closest. I'll go ahead and do that. I can say bounding box. My system is world. Let's make it capped. Yes. And now, at least they're going in the opposite direction, which again is not too bad, but they're still skewed and kind of funny looking. This is probably the best option for a cone, unless you wanted the texture map to go the opposite direction, in which case you could try a different one. But in reality, sometimes we need a little bit more specific information. So I'm going to jump back for a second. And this time, I'm going to go into my texture map, and I'm going to choose this option here that looks like a little present with a bow around it. It's the first one. If I click on it, it's called Unwrap. And when I click on Unwrap, it says to select the seams. And so this is, if we could imagine, you guys remember in 130, you had to do those like shapes and cut them out, and they folded together to make the little paper shape. Remember that a little bit, vaguely? Okay, this is essentially, we're doing the same thing here. So it's going to ask me for my seams. And so let's say I want a seam around the bottom, probably, and it would be nice to have a seam along the side. So there's a seam along the side. So if this unwraps, it's going to give me a circle, and it's going to give me a flattened out kind of it's going to give me that would roll together to make it, plus a circle. So we'll go ahead and say OK, and I'll hit enter. And it now has created it. And if I look at it, you see it has a little bit of a swirl to it. I would like to be able to customize that a little bit more. And I can do that by using this UV editor button, which is kind of like an orange and white checkered board pattern. And if I click on that, it'll ask me to draw a rectangle. So I can go ahead and draw a rectangle. this, and it shows me the flattened out object. So there's the flattened out, there's my circle. But I can't see what it looks like just yet. And so I'm going to turn on, under this UV editor, I'm going to turn on use texture for right now. And instead of saying UV grid texture, I'm going to click on this plus, and I'm going to go find my bitmap that represents this image. So I need to go back to my flash drive. I'll go into my resources. And of course, this is the more complicated, fancier way of doing things. And you can see that using the presets are the easy solution. So let me go into my V-Ray materials, and let me pick my siding. It was under wood, and it was the rough wood staggered. There's my image. I'll go ahead and say open. I'll go ahead and say OK. And you know what? I'm going to have to turn off my infinite plane because it's hiding the texture. There's the texture. Apologize, I have to turn that off so I can see it. And now I can manipulate these objects, and it will change how they look here. See if I can get a good view of it there. Something like that. So as I move this object around, it will change how it's applied. I could take this, I could rotate it, for example. Turn off ortho for a second. And it's going to change where the seam. So this board here, let's see if we can point this out. OK, you see this little piece of wood grain there? I'm going to put that right at the base. And so that little piece of wood grain matches up with this piece of wood grain. So I can basically customize exactly how the texture applies to these objects. That then is going to correspond to what's happening underneath. I can rotate the objects individually, and I can make a custom mapping of it. This is, of course, far more involved than picking one of the presets. But I want to at least introduce you to the concept of it. And you can end up with a result that you couldn't otherwise get. There's my seam in the back. And when you do this sort of thing, you have to think about, oh, there's going to be a seam. This is the side I don't want to render. Right? That's the back side. And when I do the rendering, it's going to be right here. And that's what I want it to look like. So when I'm all done, I'll go ahead and click on the apply. And all of those guides, the UV editor, go away. I can bring them back if I want. But for right now, they've gone away. And we can see the preview of how that kind of comes together and how it wraps. This little jaggedness on the side, you guys see how that's not quite smooth? That will go away when I do the actual render of this object. So let me show you a quick preview. Let me turn on my infinite plane again. So there it is, jagged. Let's go ahead and render it. And you can see very quickly that this is not the same as this. And this happens in the preview mode. I told you the preview mode isn't exactly what it looks like. This is what we're seeing here. So it definitely smooths out in the final render. OK, so I have the cone done. Let's go ahead and hide that one. And I'm going to move back to my more complicated object here. So let me zoom, selected. There it is. And so in this case, I have a much more complicated object that I need to apply a texture map to. The easiest thing here would be to go ahead and take my object, go to my properties here, and we'll just apply a simple box map to it. There it is. I'll use my bounding box. I'll use my world. I'll have it capped yes. And I'll come over here to the x equals y equals z to make it consistent. And my scale is reasonable, but it's kind of hard because of the way that these corners come together and these edges. Right? You see that there's kind of a funny little seam right there because the shape is not a normal shape. So instead of doing this, right, I might play with a different option. So let me jump back like that. And let's try a cylindrical map instead. There it is. But instead of just picking a bounding box, I'm actually going to create it. So let's do the base of the cylinder. And I'm doing this in the side view maybe like that and like that. I do want it capped. And now you can see that it's, at least on this half of the object, it's going around my object and wrapping it, which is pretty nice. In this context, the shape started here and went that direction. I may need to view, and I can do that right here using show mapping. And I can see the cylinder that represents the mapping. And I can actually move that cylinder down the object to have it cover the object the way I want it to. And then when I'm done, I can click on, oops, sorry, object. I can click right here to hide the mapping. And so in this case, it wraps really nicely around my object, including the little curved pieces, but it's really nasty on the two ends. And so for here, maybe the best strategy is to have a different material for the ends. Maybe it's a metal, polished metal, or some evolution, so that I'm getting what I want around the wrapping and not worrying so much about one end or the other. Okay? So I know that texture mapping can be a bit on the challenging side to get your head around and kind of sort through it. I think the key is, whenever possible, use the presets. And then you can, of course, get into the unwrap. Let me show you the unwrap for this object just so you can see what it would look like. One thing that is important to point out is you don't ever want to stack texture maps on top of each other. So before I create the unwrap, I'm actually going to delete the mapping on this object. And then I'll go back and say, let me apply the unwrap. The other thing is, this is currently a joined object, and I'm applying the texture map to the joined object, so it applies to all the individual surfaces in this joined object. The alternative, if this was exploded, as long as I select all of the object at once, even if it's not joined, I can still apply the custom mapping to it as an overall object. It's easier, though, if we go ahead and join it and then apply the custom mapping. Select a surface or mesh to use as, oh, sorry, it's not custom mapping, it's the unwrap. My fault. So select seams. I'm going to pick that. And this is very much how you would be thinking about this as an unrolled object. Oops. Hold down Control so I can deselect that and that edge. So that should get me there now that I have those seams. I'll go ahead and hit Enter. And then I can go back to my UV editor. I can draw the UV editor. Let me turn off my infinite plane so we can see it. There it is with my texture applied to it. Now I can make edits to this. So we could, for example, I could rotate. And let's say that I wanted these to be going the long direction. If I were then looking at my object, now they're going in the long direction and wrapping around that way. I can also take these objects, and independently of what I see, I could scale them. And let's say I want this to be bigger, which would make my texture mapping smaller. I could also then go back and I could rotate this maybe a little bit more that way, and we can see how it's applied to the object. So it's a much more custom way of applying something like this, but it may or may not be what you're after. But I at least want to introduce you to the concept. When I'm done, I'll go ahead and click Apply. And now that's applied. So here's another example here where the previewed mode shows all of these scalloped edges. If I went to the actual render and I perform the render, you can see that all of those are going to become nice smooth curves, not the weird little jagged thing. So the preview mode is never what the actual render turns out like. So I've gone through a bunch about texture mapping and kind of how you would go about manipulating it and working with it. At this point, I'm going to take a break from texture mapping, and I'm going to move into having you create something that's real. So the first half today, you could say the first hour, 40 minutes, something like that, I want you to play around with texture mapping and really feel like you understand it and can do it. Okay? Then the second half, I want you to go ahead and go back to the bridge file that we created 2 classes ago and the glass file that we created last class. And we're going to work with those two in a new file. So I'm going to go ahead and open up Rhino again and create a new Rhino instance. I'll go to New, Large Object, Inches. And we'll wait for it to open. All right, and so this new file, I'm going to start by saving it. So I'll go to File, Save As, and I'm going to put it into today's exercise, 207, and we'll call this final, scene, and this is exercise, EX 207 for spring of 2017, and I'll go ahead and click Save. So I start by that. The next thing is I'm going to set up my scene. So just like we did in the last exercise, or the last half of this, I'll create a layer for environment. Select it and type environment. I'll create a sublayer for sun. And I'll create a sublayer for infinite plane. While I'm on the infinite plane layer, I'll go ahead and create the infinite plane. There it is. And while I'm on the sun layer, I double-click to change layers. I'll create a little box here. And I'll go ahead and draw in the missing directional light button here. To create that directional light, we'll get rid of the box. And now I have the light and the infinite plane. We'll go ahead and lock both of those layers. So I'll move back up to the default layer, lock, and lock. So that's just giving me context to work with. Now we'll go ahead and we'll leave the default layer active, but we'll get rid of our extra layers. I'll hold down Shift and then press the delete button here so that everything else is gone. So one of the things that you'll find in the world of Rhino is that we're going to get to a point where your drawings are going to become complicated. So fast forward in your mind for a second and think about, I'm working on my final project. I have a house. That house or cabin is going to be in a giant scene. But inside that house, I have a toilet, I have a bathtub, I have a kitchen faucet, I have a couch. I have all these things that go into it. If I have my house and I have all the things into it, the Rhino file itself is going to get huge. And so rather than put everything into a scene, we're going to use something quite prolifically in this class that's called blocks. And you may have exposure to this in the world of AutoCAD a little bit if you took an AutoCAD class or you took we talked about it briefly in 135. And the idea of a block is you have a referenced file that contains that geometry, and you say, put it into this scene. The edits on that file, I go back and I change the fabric on my couch, will get automatically uploaded into your new file when you open it. So it's a really powerful tool in Rhino. So in this context, we're going to bring in a couple blocks and bring them into this scene. So before I bring a block in, though, and this happens whether you download a piece of furniture from online or you create it out of your own head, is you want to make sure you actually open the file and clean it up. So I'm going to go back to my work from the bridge. And so let me go into my folder here. And that was in, what was it? What did we do it in, 204? No? 205. Conveniently, I don't have it. How nice. Why don't I have it? That's weird. I have that one. All right, well, bear with me for just a second. We're going to have to do a very stripped down version of the bridge. Come on. Good news is you all have your bridge, so you don't have to worry about this. OK, so it was a bridge. It was, what was it, at 36, 48 inches there, native. Actually, you know what? I should have just drawn it really fast. Hold on a second. You guys can bear with me for 1 second, right? All right. -2, negative there. And 30. No. 6 inches. All right. Sorry for that. Let's just do this real quick. I know this is not how I did the end, but I'm trying to save a little bit of time for you guys. All right. Sorry I didn't save it. So when I start to look at this piece, I want to do a couple things before I bring it in. The first thing is I'm going to look at my layers. I don't want all these layers because I don't want to come in with layers that are unnamed and cloud my original file. So let's rename this default layer, and we'll call this bridge. And underneath the bridge layer, I'm going to create something called concrete. And I want it to be a sublayer of the bridge layer, so I'm going to drag it on top of the bridge layer to make it a sublayer. I will turn this object into, or put it on the concrete layer. So let me apply, or change object layer. So it's now on the concrete layer. We'll get rid of layers 2 through 5. Couple notes. Lights will never come through, so you don't ever put a light in a block reference because it won't work. And 2, the fewer the layers, the better. Separating by materials is always a good idea. So let's go ahead and load concrete. So I'll go to materials. I'll right-click and say load material. Let's get into my concretes here. Resources, V-Ray, V-Ray materials, concrete. I'm going to do a rough board form here. And we'll apply that. The reason I'm picking rough board form is because we'll have to do texture mapping to it. Let me apply this to my layer, that is the concrete layer. And then let's look at this in rendered mode. So there it is. You go ahead and zoom, selected. And as we look at it, the texture mapping isn't quite there yet. So this is close to a box. So I'll select everything. I'll go to my properties. I'll go to my texture mapping. And I'll apply a box map to it. We'll use bounding box, world. It is capped. And we now have a better texture map of it. We can confirm that the shape is and the scale is the way we want it. It's pretty close the way it is. If I were to select it, I could adjust this to maybe, I don't know, 1.25, a little bit tighter. Something like that. Looks pretty good. So now I have it set up the way I want it. I'm going to save this file as bridge. So I'll go to File, Save As, and we'll put it into, we'll create a new folder for EX205, which is where it should have been first pace. We'll call this bridge. And I'll go ahead and click Save. I don't want extra things like the curves. Those can go away now. So there is a way of selecting all the curves at once. If I type SEL and then it's curve, CRV, it's the bottom one, it will select all curves at once, and I can then delete it. I could also go through and manually select them. I'm just trying to make this file as clean as possible. The other thing is I want to control where this goes in space. So if your bridge is floating off here somewhere, that's fine when you're creating it. But when you use it as a block reference, we actually want to move this object to 0, 0, 0, because that's where it's going to be inserted from. It gives us a better control. So now that this is saved, I'll go to File, Save, make sure all is good, and I'm going to jump back to my final scene. Here it is. And I'm going to go to Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Instance. And this is going to allow me to browse for my file. So under Name here, I'm going to click the little folder, and I'm going to go find that bridge file. So let's go into Live Demonstrations, 205. Didn't I just save it there? Hold on a second. My bad. Go back to my final scene, and there it is. And when I click on Open, we're going to see some options. Okay? We do want to insert it as a block instance. There's a way of just dropping it into the scene as the geometry itself. We want a block instance. I want a prompt for my insertion point. I don't know where it's going to be yet. The scale I want to remain uniform. The rotation I want it to be set at 0. I'll go ahead and say OK, and I get the next dialog box, which is the File Insert Options, or excuse me, Insert File Options. It's going to be called Bridge, which is fine. It is read and linked from the file. And here's the key section. Under block definition type, I have 3 choices. I have embed, I have embed and link, and I have link. Embed means take the block definition and stick the whole thing in the file, and I don't care where it came from. Embed and link says stick the whole thing in the file, but maintain a source link to where the original was. Okay, which is a good option, because you can go back and edit the original and have it repopulate as you want to, but it also contains the complete object inside of your Rhino file. So on the surface, this seems like a good option. If you lose the original, you still have the geometry, all is good. The problem here is if you imagine a Rhino file with a bunch of these blocks in it and a really complicated Rhino file, your Rhino file is going to be huge. So that presents the third option, which is just plain link. This means you have to keep the original. I can't delete or lose the original file, but as long as I don't delete or lose the original file, it doesn't add too much data to my Rhino file. It's just a reference. Kind of like the world of InDesign, where we reference files. Okay, when I go to render, it's going to go find that file, make sure it's in the scene. So I'm going to leave it as link for right now. And I'm also going to leave my layer style as reference. This will help long term. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And we see that my bridge now comes in. I can place it anywhere I want, so we'll place it right there. And we see over in my layers that I get this grayed out bridge.3dm, which contains the bridge layer and the concrete layer. The concrete layer has the concrete material already applied to it. So if I were to switch this into rendered mode, we'd already see, there it is, there's my material with the texture mapping applied. It's a little bit low, so let's move it up. It's a bridge, maybe. There it is, floating in space there. And you'll notice that because it's a referenced file, when I go to select it, I can't select any of the individual pieces of it. It's the whole object. But I can copy it multiple times. Going along here to build out my bridge. And the materials follow right along the way they're supposed to. So that the advantage of this, and we'll go ahead and save this for right now, is that I can go back and I can say, you know what, I don't really like this material. Let me go back to my original bridge file. There's the piece. And let me go ahead and change my material. So I'll go into materials and, let me load. I didn't like that concrete. Let's load the troweled finish. There it is. Let me change this and apply material to layer, concrete. There. Oops. There it's been applied. There's my troweled finish. I'll go ahead and say File Save. And when I jump back to my bridge file, nothing's changed. But if I go to Edit, Blocks, Block Manager, you see that bridge is listed, but it says linked file is newer. So something's changed in the linked file. Let me go ahead and update it. And I'll say OK. And it's now updated to the new material. So I make my changes in my small, easy-to-read file here, and those changes automatically apply down the road. So let's say that I wanted to make a further change. Let me look in the top view here real quick. You know what? I'm really into castles, so I'm going to cut out a little, like a crenellation there at the top. So let me take this object, and actually let me do this. I'm going to subtract. This is a Boolean subtract the difference. My surfaces and polysurfaces to subtract from would be this. This is my object right there and there. I just did that to cut that little piece out. Okay, now that I have that little piece, if I save it and I go back to my final, there it is, and I go back to my blocks, block manager. Once again, the linked file is newer. Let me go ahead and update it. Sometimes this pops up if you're replacing material. Generally, replace existing material, apply all. One block updated successfully, and now that change is populated across all those blocks. So you can see how this becomes really powerful. You create a very simple window, piece of glass in it, go back later, add detail, chamfer the edges, whatever, it automatically comes in as part of your reference. So it can be a very, very powerful thing to do. So let me go ahead and come back to the glass piece that I created. I'm going to bring this in as well. But before we do that, I want to organize it. So let's go ahead and create, let's call this glass window. Let's create a sublayer for metal. Let's create a new sublayer for glass. And let's make sure that the glass is on the glass. Let's make sure that the metal is on the metal. And I want to make sure I applied these by, oh good, they're assigned by layer. I never applied materials. So let me go ahead and load up some materials. Let's go and load a metal. So what did I do? Resources, V-Ray, materials, metal. And let's do silver. And that's under glass. I'm going to create a glass just so that it's a little easier to see. Let me go create standard. We'll make it kind of a bluish color, maybe about like that. We'll make the transparency maybe a dark gray. And it's pretend glass. It doesn't really look like glass. If you load a real glass, that's fine. But it won't look great until you get a background in. So let's go ahead and apply this to my glass layer. Perfect. I'm not going to worry about texture mapping too much on these images because the glass and the metal don't matter too much. Let's get rid of the extra layers so that it's nice and clean. And it is already at 0.000, so that's helpful. And I'll go ahead and save this. So let's do a save as, and we'll call this glass window. I'll click save. And let me jump over into my final scene. Here it is. And let's drop this in. So I'll go up to Edit, Blocks, Insert Block Instance. And this time I don't want to insert the bridge. I want to find a new file. And we'll go to my glass window, open. Default, all these options are fine. I'll say OK. Then we get here. Again, I want it linked as a reference. I'll go ahead and say OK. And now it comes in. Turns out that my rotation is off a little bit. So let's go ahead and rotate that. Just a regular rotate will do just fine. Let's turn it that direction. There we go. So now I want a bunch of these as part of the render. So I'm going to use a command called array. So I'll select it, and I'll type array. And it's going to ask me for the number in the x direction, I don't know, 20. Number in the y direction, 10. Number in the, oh, sorry. Let's try that one more time. I don't want any in the y. So let's array I need to go back and reference. It is in the y. So number in the x direction should be 1. Number in the y direction should be 20. Number in the z direction should be 10. Y spacing is going to be from there to there. Z spacing would be from there to there. And now you see I was creating that wall. I have to enter to accept. I can also go back and edit my numbers. So if I wanted my y number to be 40, I can go back and do it. It gets taller. If I wanted my z number to be fewer, let's go 6. Right, you can see I can make those modifications as I work on it. When I'm done, I'll hit enter. And I now have that repeating wall pattern. You'll see, though, when you create something with a lot of geometry like that, it immediately starts to slow down a bit. So let's go ahead and zoom in just a bit. So I get something about like that. Before I do the rendering, I'm going to change one thing, and that's under V-Ray Options. I'm going to go in and change my environment so that my sky is white rather than black. So I don't have the black bar with the black sky. So that's white. Under Output, I'm going to go ahead and get my view aspect so that it matches with what I'm seeing on my screen. And then we'll close this, and I'll go ahead and click the R for render. And this will bring out the render for us. And there we are with the final version. When I'm done, I'll go ahead and click on the little save disk and save it, and this will be the image that I post as part of today. So you don't need to post. I'm just making sure. I did ask you under part 2 to save a rendered view of the texture maps on those random objects. Save one rendered view of that. Save this one as your final one with the blocks. This is the one that I want as your featured image, though. Okay? You don't need to comment on this exercise either. We haven't really had to comment on anything yet, but it'll come eventually. I'll remind you. Are there any questions? I know it was a lot to take in, and I talked for a long time, but at the same time, this is kind of learning V-Ray. We have to get through it. All right? I'll turn you loose.